Hello and welcome to Foolish Musings. In this episode, we'll be examining Mahavira and Jainism. As per usual, I'd like to start with some disclaimers. In this particular episode, I will present Jainism as a holistic and contained philosophy without some of the more intricate complexities and internal conflicts that exist between differing sects within the Jain faith. It's important to note there is two major sects within Jainism. You have the Svetāmbara, who are the clothed Jains, which I think of what a lot of people think of when they think of a Jain, which wear a cloth over their mouth to prevent them from inhaling insects and wear the typical white robes. You also have the Digambara, or the sky-clad Jains, who wear, talking about, once again, the monks or the ascetics in this particular tradition, they walk around completely naked. There's some other minor doctrinal differences between the two different sects with regards to wearing clothes, obviously, for the ascetics, but also when it comes to the Digambara, they don't believe that women can achieve ascension within their lifetime, and rather look at it as opposed to people going through the cycle of the wheel, being reborn as a man, and then continuing along the route towards enlightenment. There's many other minor sects within Jainism, and as such, I just want us to remember that it's not a holistic and internally cohesive philosophy, more so as a living, breathing, and multifaceted religious tradition embodied by millions of people worldwide. So today I'm going to be talking about Jainism. The Jainism is a faith, a living religion that exists in India, although now adherents are spread across the world, which is very important to understand in the context of both its time and then its influence. So Jainism is a religion which has emerged out of that Brahmanic culture that we examined in the Upanishads episode, where we're talking about a Aryan culture which is very much based upon the teachings of the Vedas, and the Upanishads sort of introduce these concepts which are key to Indic culture and Indic philosophy, things such as MOKSHA, SAMSARA, and the concepts, or at least the beginning ideas of the concepts of karma and dharma. And Jainism, although it emerges out of this tradition, is also heterodox. It's something that is questioning and going against this tradition. So it can be seen as one of the questioning unorthodox schools that exists alongside and within a Hindu-dominated system, but which isn't part of Hindu philosophy, but rather this broader concept of Indic philosophy. Now, I should have mentioned this in the disclaimer, but for Jains, at least practicing Jains, the idea that Jainism has a beginning is kind of a misnomer. Within their own concept of time, which we'll talk about later on, there is no real beginning and end of the universe. There's only sort of a continuation of the same cycles over and over again. And so to suggest that Jainism sort of had a beginning is sort of to misunderstand Jainism within its own thought conception. However, the person who was key in shaping Jainism in its very early era was a man by the name of Mahavira. Now, he is the person who's regarded to give Jainism its current day form, and it's one of the reasons why he is sometimes wrongly, at least from the conception of many Jains, called the founder of Jainism. Within the Jain conception of the universe, Mahavira is one of the world's most recent Tirthankara, as in an enlightened individual, a forward builder, someone who is helping to show the way across the river of life and into this sort of ascension into moksha, away from the suffering that is life in this world. Now, Mahavira was originally born as a prince in northeast India in the traditional date is around about 600 BCE, although some scholars are suggesting as a contemporary of the Buddha that he may have been in and around 400 BCE, which puts him right in this axial age when you're talking about the different developments that are going on in China with Confucius, Lao Tzu, and other thinkers, and then in Greece when you talk about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So Mahavira was the son of a king, Siddhartha, and queen, Trishala, and were members of the Kshatriya, or that warrior caste that we were talking about in the Upanishads episode. However, at the age of 30, Mahavira turns away from the life at the royal palace and becomes an ascetic, or a sadhana, one who renounces all worldly pleasures and comforts. And after a 12-year period, at least in the traditional sense of the mythology that surrounds him, of subjecting himself to extremely long and arduous periods of fasting and meditation, he eventually attained enlightenment. And it's at this point he's called Mahavira, from Maha, great, and Vira, hero. And at this stage he sort of develops a community of monks, of other fellow ascetics, and he preaches to them the different aspects of what would eventually become the religion of Jainism. Now, there is a bit of a, once again, that divergence between the two communities of the Jains, where you have, on one side, the Digambara think that the texts which Mahavira passed down to his followers were all lost, and as such, people nowadays are only really able to practice from the teachings of those who heard the teachings of those who heard Mahavira. So we're sort of almost 2 steps removed in that tradition. Whereas the Svetambara think that we've actually still got the essence of those texts in some of the Jaina Sutras, which I will provide in the references as you go forward. But as we can see, there's almost sort of like a mystic aspect to Mahavira as a founding figure within Jainism. And then once again, as I've stated, within the conception of Jainism, not really a founding figure, more so just a continuation of this ongoing cycle of growth and decay, of suffering and greater happiness. So I mentioned previously that in Jainism there isn't really a conception of the beginning of the world, and as such Mahavira can't really be described as the founder of Jainism. What you need to understand, and the Jain conception of time, is that it's infinite in either direction. So there's no beginning and there's no end to the universe, just increasing cycles of greater happiness and then greater suffering. And in this sense, we're all destined to sort of go through those cycles of samsara ad infinitum, as we slowly go through periods where things are better and happier and more people are able to achieve moksha, and then periods of increasing sorrow where things are difficult. Some of the forward makers aren't there to show us the path, and eventually we all are sort of left without guidance in the world, and people are at the greatest point of sadness before the wheel starts to turn again and we go through that period of uplifting happiness. Now, we've talked in the Upanishads about this concept of samsara, which is the idea of rebirth and going through multiple life cycles on the basis of how you previously performed, whether you were good or bad in a previous lifetime, that sort of karma-dharma interaction. But within the Jain tradition, we see the crystallizations of one of the first really self-contained ideas of samsara, and it's this idea of a 4-step realm. So in reality, you have people who are living a celestial life, so divine beings, who in the Jain tradition aren't necessarily godlike, in the sense that they're not creator figures with divine power and immortality, but rather it's seen as more a reward for people that live a very good life. However, at the same time, it's kind of a punishment, because the way that people act when they're in this divine realm of opulence and bodily pleasures, they don't really focus on that letting go of attachment, of divorcing themselves of the suffering and attachments of the world, and thus dragging themselves back down into the realm of humanity. And it's this realm of humanity, or what the Jains will call the 5 sense souls, which is where the real work can be done. So if somebody has lived a good life, but is actually thinking about the way that their life is impacting upon the world, they won't be reborn as a celestial being, even though being a celestial is good. They'll be reborn as a human, because it's only from that 5 sense being, from the human, then one can truly achieve enlightenment. Now, for those who aren't as good, there is a descending tiering of sensed beings. I'll discuss them a little bit with souls, but basically you're starting at the most human-like animals, I suppose you could say, creatures that have 4 senses, and then descending downwards, down to, well, at the bottom, worms. And then finally, there's also the infernal realm. Now, for the Jains, the infernal realm is a horrible place, but it's where people who do horrible things go, and they sort of end up in this loop of just doing bad things to themselves and bad things to each other, living a life of abject suffering. And it's this sense, this 4-placed world of the human who can achieve moksha, the celestial and the infernal beings which are being punished or rewarded for their good deeds but who are still attached and stuck on this cycle of life, and the lesser sensed beings which are still very much ensouled, however once again without the ability through rationality to achieve moksha. So I've already discussed this concept of the 5 sensed and the lesser sensed beings in the earthly conception of the Jain world. And this is important to understand because for the Jains, all things are ensouled. So yes, on the far right-hand side of the spectrum, you have 5 soul beings, including humans and other animals, which for the Jains have these concepts or these senses of touch, taste, smell, vision, and hearing. However, further down the list, they then also have other creatures. For instance, for them they think of the bee, which they say only has 4 senses. So in Jain sort of metaphysics for these 4 sense souls, they only get to touch, taste, smell, and see. Further down the list you have the 3 sense beings, so an example being an ant in the Jain tradition, which they believe only can touch, taste, and smell. So once again, this is primitive biology. Maybe if you think in the same sense of Aristotle, when he was trying to make his divisions of the world, and they see things such as ants not necessarily having that sense of sight. And then at the lowest of the mobile souls, you see worms, so 2-sensed beings, who only have the ability to sense with touch and taste. Now, the thing is for many people in their conceptions of the soul, for instance Aristotle, they might stop at this level or they might continue into the world of botany. However, the Jains go a bit further than that. Yes, they do consider plants to be 1-sensed beings, as in beings with the ability to feel, but also water and air and fire and earth. All of these things have a soul in the Jain tradition. And this is where you start to understand that for the Jain, violence against all things is violence against an ensouled being. And it's very important to understand this aspect of their metaphysics when we start looking later at Jain ethics. Now, Jain metaphysics might focus on the soul, but for the Jain physics, we almost have to think in an atomistic sense, something along the lines of Democritus, where we see the ideas of matter, space, time, motion, and rest all being these atomistic properties which combine together and they're not ensouled in and of themselves. So when we're talking about a fire soul or an earth soul, that is the metaphysical property which is inhabiting these other soulless objects and making them animated within the world. So there is an atomistic world in the Jain model of physics, and every single part of it, though, is inhabited by these souled beings, which have the ability to feel suffering at the most. Even the earth soul, or the water soul, or the fire soul has the ability to feel pain. And so there is this conception of the world which is completely devoid of the sort of Atman-Brahman divide, where there's this underlying substrate of the Brahman. It's more so a world which is completely enmeshed with many different atomistic souls, occupying an infinitesimal world of infinite time, infinite space, and infinite matter. Now, for Jains, this conception of matter extends to their theory of karma. So karma isn't seen as some sort of abstract metaphysical construct which is linked to one's soul in some sort of unknowable magical construct, but rather it's seen as in a very atomistic sense. So karma is seen as a material which then mixes with the soul, and it's this admixture of the soul and karma which essentially creates the idea of attachment and then the inability of the soul to escape through moksha. So for the Jains there is a division, however. They see a division between destructive and non-destructive karma. So a destructive karma is those aspects of one's life which will make it impossible to pursue the life that leads to enlightenment. So these include knowledge obscuring karma. So this is the idea of one's innate intelligence. So if one is born without a high degree of intelligence, one might not necessarily achieve moksha. Perception obscuring karma. So this is the idea of the senses. Although there are some very notable exceptions within the Jain tradition, the idea that if one is denied one's senses, and that includes the mind, so if one is mad or if one is suffering from the inability to hear, speak or see, one won't be able to achieve moksha. You've got those ideas of obstruction karmas, so things that prevent people from enjoyment or allow enjoyment, or people that are prevented from conducting charity or progressing intellectually because they're too tied up with their own worries. This is another form of karma. And finally, they see delusion or deluding karma, which is essentially that karma which, too bad, so sad, you've ended up in the wrong life and you have the wrong faith. You don't have the right conduct, the right rules and regulations to guide you down the right path. And we'll talk a little bit about this later when we get to knowledge. But delusional karma is also that which forces us into the realm of attachment. And one of the key aspects which the Jains see as preventing progress. However, one of the big things about Jain philosophy is the idea that largely speaking, unless we're talking about Digambra or the philosophy where women aren't going to achieve enlightenment, but for most Jains it's this idea of people, regardless of their life, regardless of who they are, as long as they don't have these destructive karmas, they're able to achieve enlightenment. Doesn't matter if they're a pauper or a king. So, there's these feeling-producing karmas of passion and health and sort of determining how healthy you are or how happy you are. That's not necessarily going to prevent you from achieving enlightenment. There's body-determining karma. So your physique, how you look, are you ugly, are you beautiful? It's not going to stop you from achieving enlightenment. Similarly, your lifespan is a form of karma, and your status in life, whether you are a king or a beggar, these are all forms of karma, but that are not necessarily important for determining whether you will achieve enlightenment. So in some ways, Jainism is a very egalitarian religion in it breaks down these barriers, and anybody can achieve the path to enlightenment, not just the most learned of the Brahmin, that certain caste. So now that we've seen karma and what karma is like in this material sense, we have a basic conception of Jain SAMSARA, or the cycle of life. Then how does one achieve moksha within the Jain philosophical tradition, or a liberation from the cycle, or this infinite cycle of time and life? Well, for the Jain, in their philosophy, life is kind of like being a boat. So you're on the sea, and then the wind and the wave, they're like the karma that is driving you in a certain direction. Maybe driving you onto the rocks, maybe driving you out to sea, far from land, or maybe just right driving you down the right path. You don't have a large degree in determining what that karma is like to begin with, because that karma could well have been determined before you were born, or could be determined in your current life cycle by some of the acts that you already conducted. But by taking the right actions, like the metaphor here talking about the boat, using the sail, the rigging, the tackle, the rudder, etc. of the boat correctly, one can navigate the intricacies of this karma, the life that's been laid out before you, and still achieve moksha, or at least a better life in the next cycle. And what is moksha? So for the Jain, the moksha is actually just the realization of the innate goodness, the innate perfection of the soul. So when the soul is imbued with all this karmic matter, it's like a sheet which is dirty. So the dirt is the karma, which is weighing down the soul, and it's that attachment to the world, the attachment to things that aren't really worth anything. And it's a very rationalistic idea that if you then take away this bad karma, if you, through renunciation, through asceticism, remove all of this karmic debt, you don't necessarily achieve something new. You just sort of end up showing the true brilliance of the soul that exists beforehand, which was already innately there. And it's this interesting conception that there's this real dualism between the body and the karmic matter which weighs it down, and then the soul, which is this eternal being which just keeps cycling through samsara, but which is innately good and in and of itself able to achieve moksha once it's been relieved of these karmic baggage. And unfortunately, it's pretty necessary to understand this conception of the soul within the metaphysical tradition of Jain philosophy to really understand Jain epistemology. So, for the Jains, there's sort of, once again, this division between the mind as an aspect of the body and then the soul as aspect of this sort of infinite and immaterial thing which continues on regardless of the death of the body. So, the soul, in the Jain tradition, has all these sort of untestable criteria of knowledge which it's able to provide. So direct knowledge, ideas of things such as clairvoyance, telepathy, omniscience, these conceptions which are kind of beyond what we would consider, at least in the modern Western field of epistemology, as a legitimate means of achieving knowledge, but which are key in terms of providing that epistemological base in terms of their theories within Jain philosophy, because they're saying that the true Mahavira and the other forward setters before him achieved omniscience, and that's how they gave us the right texts. And it's these right teachings and right learnings which is key within some of the later Jain ethics. However, what it does mean, though, is that if you're someone that hasn't achieved clairvoyance, telepathy, and omniscience, you have to rely upon indirect knowledge. And for the Jains, this is actually surprisingly skeptical, because the only forms of knowledge that they see outside of the knowledge directly provided through the soul is via the senses and via scripture. So, when it comes to a theory of cognition for the Jains, unless you are one of these great beings who has already achieved enlightenment in this cycle of the world, you're stuck in this loop where, yes, you can observe something at first, and then you become curious, and then you confirm your first observation, and then you achieve an impression, and the metaphor which is used is like a cockerel looking in the mirror and then fighting itself. We are able to form these ideas and these thoughts, but we don't really know that they're based upon something real. We don't know if they're true. They might be true from our point of view, but they're not necessarily true in the whole. And it's this sort of idea of like skepticism in terms of the way that we think, which underlies some of the most important aspects of Jain logic. So in Jain logic, it's multi-valued. It's not like when we look back to Aristotle, where you've got this idea of the bivalence of truth. Something must either be true or not be true. The law of excluded middle, something that can't hold both a truth and untruth value at the same time. Rather, for Jains, within Jain philosophy that is, it's about this idea of sort of holding a position of reserved judgment. So, in terms of truth values, a statement, well, maybe it's true. Or maybe it's false. Or maybe it's both true and false. However, it goes deeper than this. Maybe it's something that is indescribable, something that can't be described in terms of both truth and falsehood. Or maybe it's indescribable, but once again holds a grain of truth. or is indescribable, and with a grain of falsehood. And finally, in this sort of seventh layer, maybe it is both true and false, but inherently indescribable. And so we have this sort of multi-valued logic. It's this sort of standpoint view where the Jain thinks that everything in the world, everybody's ideas, everyone's point of view and opinions, they're all maybe right or maybe wrong. But unless you have achieved enlightenment, no one's really going to know for sure. The best way to describe this conception of Jain logic is through an analogy which is rather popular in Jainism, of that of an elephant. And so these 6 blind men happen upon an elephant, and obviously they can't see the beast, but each of them reaches out and touches a different part of the animal and attempts to describe what they feel. And so for the man who grabs the trunk of the elephant, he says, an elephant is like a snake. For the one that grabs the tusk of the elephant, he says, well, an elephant's like a spear. For the one that grabs the ear, well, an elephant's clearly like a fan. And for the one that wraps his arms around the leg of the elephant, well, an elephant is like the trunk of a tree. The 5th blind man puts his hands up against the side of the elephant and says, clearly an elephant is like a wall. While the final blind man grabs the tail of the elephant and says, well, it's obvious to me that the elephant is like a rope. It's this conception of all these individuals, they hold a grain of truth, but they don't really understand the truth holistically. And it's the quote that is often stated from within Jain philosophy is that all traditions are true, it's just that they're true from a different perspective. So one can really ask, if you hold such a skeptical standpoint, how could you possibly have a strong ethical basis to your philosophy? And this is an interesting aspect of Jainism. Because it has such a strong built-in skepticism, you would think that it would be difficult to make a strong statement of ethics, but yet Jainism in some ways is one of the most extreme and austere of the religions that came out of India. So you have a commitment to ahimsa, or non-violence, which is the root of Jain ethics. But you also have this idea of aparigraha, or non-possessiveness, where we're not possessing or attempting or envying the material world or its goods or attachments. And finally, you have anekantavada, which is this idea of non-absolutism, which is best expressed in the idea of the elephant. It's this idea that, well, I'm not necessarily going to know things 100%. I'm only seeing it from one perspective of the world, and until I achieve enlightenment, I can only be satisfied with this partial knowledge. And as such, I should never really jump to conclusions about others' points of view. So with these basic 3 conceptions as the heart of Jain ethics, there's essentially 4 components that make up the entirety of the Jain sort of vow system. And it's these basic vows which are taken by both the lay and ascetics, just to differing degrees. So for Jains there is that inherent anti-violence, so non-violence vow, where an individual, if they're a lay person, will essentially constrict their violence to a single area and try not to spread violence as far as possible. Whereas, on the other hand, an ascetic will completely detach themselves from the normal world, reliant upon the laypersons to provide them very limited sustenance and sort of grazing, going from point to point to limit their impact. And it's interesting because you need to think about it. It's not just violence in the conception that many Westerners would think, but it's a deep sense of violence. It's that idea that even cutting lumber, starting a fire and boiling some water to make a cup of tea is an act of violence. Every act of living is a consumption of another ensouled being. Even breathing involves a consumption of souls, be it microscopic or even motes of air. Now, other key components of these vows involve no stealing and truth, so making sure that one doesn't go down the paths of covetousness or falsehood, but also this idea of chastity. Now, very old fashion term when we think about it in a Western sense, but for Jains this meant if you're a layperson, monogamy, so only one individual as a partner, but then if you're an ascetic, a complete abstinence from sexual activity. And finally, once again, we return to the idea of non-possessiveness, or aparigraha. And for the layperson, that means not really converting a lot of personal wealth and material goods, having very minimalistic or Spartan lifestyle. But for the ascetic, it becomes an art form. It becomes a point where one gives up all things and becomes non-attached, both to possessions but also to one's own body and self. So I've already kind of alluded to this, but with an ethical system based upon non-violence, non-possessiveness and non-absolutism, it's going to be difficult for this caste of ascetics to essentially go about the act of being ascetic. And so you end up with Jain societies that are sort of structured into a four-person system. So you have the lay people, so the lay men and the lay women, who make up the majority of Jains, and they sort of sit at the bottom of the hierarchy, not necessarily politically or culturally, but in terms of that spiritual awakeness. And then you have a division, once again along gender lines, with the male and female ascetics. So the sadhu, male, or sadhvi, female ascetics. And these are the individuals who are achieving that higher path, aiming to drastically minimize the violence they commit to the world, and attempting to really embody the vows and ethics of the Jain tradition. This is where we come to what could be described as I wouldn't necessarily call it a dark side. It's almost a logical conclusion of the Jain's rational and logical worldview. It's a very tight, neatly closed, and it makes a lot of sense internal to its cultural paradigm. SALLEKHANA is this conception within the Jain tradition where, as one gets closer to death, an individual slowly deprives themselves of food, and then essentially goes through a process of self-mortification to the point where they die. And it's about, in the Jain tradition, minimizing one's impact. For a lot of Westerners, particularly those who are very strongly imbued within a Judeo-Christian tradition, they might see this as suicide. And it's this conception that suicide is a horrible thing and people are throwing away their lives. This is horrible, that people are mortifying themselves and starving themselves to death. But within the Jain tradition, this is less suicide, and in some ways the Jain tradition is kind of anti-suicide. It's saying that to throw away one's life, you're throwing away the opportunity to decrease the violence in the world more broadly, but also you're kind of trying to contravene the lifetime determining karma that exists within one's body. But rather, SALLEKHANA is about reducing that violence. So just the act of living for the Jains is an act of violence. Life can only thrive on life. And so for Jains, it's this conception of if one entirely removes the needs of one's body, of both food and water and breath even, and then no longer has attachment to one's body, because it's attachment to one's body which is one aspect of possessiveness, which is against Jain ethics, which then leads to either at least a better life in the next reincarnation, or potentially through to enlightenment. So, in some ways, one of the best ways to examine the Jain philosophy conception of what it is to be a person is through the parable of the well. It's famous within the Jain tradition, and it's also become more famous in those that study Eastern philosophy. And it's the idea that there's this person, they're walking home, and then they're walking through these villages, cities, harbours. Eventually they get lost, and they're in this forest filled with trees, wild beasts, and as they're stumbling over a rugged path, they see an elephant, mad, angry, fiercely trumpeting, charging at them with upraised trunk. and they run away from the trumpeting elephant, and then suddenly they see a horrible, evil demoness holding a sharp sword, and she's laughing loud and shrill, and they're trembling with fear and looking in all directions, trying to find a way to escape. And then they sees this great banyan tree, and he runs and he reaches for the great tree, but its trunk is so smooth and its branches so high that he can't get up and climb this tree and escape. So he looks around in fear, but right nearby he sees an old well covered with grass. And afraid of the death that faces him, and he just wants to live a moment longer, he flings himself into the well at the foot of the banyan tree, and as he's falling down, he grabs onto a clump of reeds that grow from the wall. And then down below him at the bottom of the well, he sees this terrible python, angry and fierce and spitting and hissing, and he knows that if he falls, he'll be killed and eaten. And he's thinking, as long as I hold onto these reeds, I'll live. And then he looks up and he sees on the clump of reeds there are two large mice, one white and one black, and they're gnawing at the base of these reeds. And then the elephant is now charging at the tree, charging at the well, and he's holding on for dear life. The reeds are slowly falling away, and then once again the elephant charges the tree, and it shakes loose a huge hive of angry bees, which falls into the well, and suddenly he's being stung by bees. It's just horrible, but just by chance, from this hive, a drop of honey falls on his head and rolls down his forehead, and then somehow reaches his lips. And for a moment's sweetness, he no longer thinks of all these other things. He doesn't think of the python at the bottom of the well, the elephant, the mice, the well, the bees. In his excited craving, he just wants more drops of honey. And it's a powerful parable, trying to clear the minds of those who are seeking to understand the Jain conception of human life. Obviously, there's some parable. There's these sort of metaphorical symbols within this story. The man is the soul, and the wandering through the forest is that sort of trip through samsara. Now, the wild elephant is death. The demoness is old age. The banyan tree is salvation, where there is no fear of death of the elephant, but which no sensual, usual human being can climb. The well is human life, and the snakes and the python at the bottom are the passions. And unknowing what to do, when the man flings himself into the well, the tuft of reed, that is the allotted span of our life, while the well itself is life itself, starting from the beginning and then down to the inevitable death of the python below. The mice, one black is night and the one white is day, is steadily gnawing through that clump of reeds which is our allotted span, and the stinging bees are manifold diseases and torments of our mortal life. And this entire system of the parable, we're suffering all this pain, all these horrible things are happening to us. The drops of honey are trivial pleasures. And they're terrible at last, because we're not thinking, we're not worried about all this horrible stuff that's happening to us. We're just worried about another drop of honey. And it's this conception of the world as sort of being surrounded by horrors and suffering that we start to understand the Jain conception of possessiveness and that desire for sensual happiness as being something that prevents us from achieving our true salvation. So, if the parable of the well gives us a bit of an understanding of the Jain conception of human life, there's really a sevenfold mechanism for understanding Jainism. It's this sort of statement of what there really is. There is the soul, and then there is matter. Then there is the influx of karma, an aspect of that matter, into the soul, and that leads to the bondage of the soul by this karma. There is then the halting of the influx of karma, and these are the sort of steps out of this process of bondage. There is then the halting, following the halting there's the removal of the karma from the body, and this inevitably leads to moksha, because the soul in and of itself is good, is perfect. It's the sort of the dirtying of the soul by karma which leads to this constant cycle of rebirth and suffering. And I'll now use yet another analogy when examining this sort of sevenfold path. So the soul is like a person, and matter is like the house that that person lives in. The influx of karma is like a cloud of dust entering into the house through an open window, and then the bondage of the soul is the house becoming dirty as the dust settles on the floor and on the furniture and on the person themselves. Halting the influx of karma is that process of non-violence, non-attachment, and non-possessiveness, non-absolutism that is achieved by shutting the window, essentially by stopping conducting these acts of violence throughout one's life. The removal of the karma is those processes of asceticism, of renunciation, which slowly remove all the material karmic matter from one's soul. And then moksha is a clean house. All it is the inherent beauty of the soul unleashed from the ugliness of the karma which is sort of built up upon it. So, if we were going to sum up Jainism in sort of like a post-it note, a t-shirt, something that you can put together and easily understand, it's really this conception of the three jewels of Jainism. It's the idea of right conduct, right faith, and right knowledge. It's about the idea of sort of following the right path as set down by those remnants of Mahavira's texts and teaching. It's about having the right understanding and the right sort of processes of thinking, about that sort of skepticism of an absolute understanding of the world. And then it's about conducting oneself in the right manner, understanding that every aspect of your life brings about suffering, as life can only feed upon life. So, as I draw to a conclusion in this episode, I want to reflect on why it's important that we understand Jainism. Jainism is one of these first sort of counterstrokes against Brahmanic philosophy as sort of espoused in the Upanishads. It's a questioning of that more ritualistic and layered conception of the world with the different varna, which would eventually lead to castes. Important to understand of like a very deep conception of egalitarianism within Jainism, and also this very rationalistic model. It's very logical, feeding in on itself, and it's a rejection of sort of mysticism. It's this idea that yes, they're accepting some metaphysical concepts without true sensory understanding, things like SAMSARA and MOKSHA, etc. But with these basic metaphysical underpinnings, everything else is sort of logically deduced. And Jainism is important not just in terms of the way that it shapes ancient Indian philosophy, with the then counterstroke against the counterstroke with later Hindu philosophy, but it's important because it's an influential philosophy which influences great thinkers such as Mahatma Gandhi, with the conception of ahimsa or non-violence being key to his conception of soul force. Thank you for taking your time to listen to today's episode. I hope that you've learned something, and if you enjoyed the episode, feel free to follow my blog at foolishmusings.com or subscribe for more videos.